Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learn to Love podcast, your guide to everything love, sex, intimacy, and relationships. Each week, your host, Zach Beach, interviews new experts on love, including couples therapists, relationship coaches, sex educators, and best-selling authors. Learn the best tips and cutting-edge wisdom to better love yourself, others, and the world. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Learn to Love podcast, everyone. I am your host, Zach Beach, and I'm here with the incredible divorce and family law attorney, Aaron Thomas. Hello, Aaron, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Zach. Really happy to be here.
Today, we're going to be asking the question, should we get a prenup? And for those that don't know, Aaron Thomas has been an attorney for almost 20 years, helping secure favorable settlements and verdicts for clients from all walks of life. He graduated from Harvard Law School in 2002, and ever since 2007, Aaron has practiced family law exclusively in order to help people navigate emotional and difficult disputes over divorce, custody, and child support. He has since covered a variety of cases in family law, and since then his attention has been trying to prevent the arguments that lead to divorce in the first place. In 2020, he founded Prenups.com, a fair and friendly take on prenuptial and postnuptial agreements. How are you today, Aaron?
I'm doing fantastic. How about yourself?
I'm well, and I'm excited. You're like by far one of the more unique guests we've had on the show. We haven't had like a lawyer or an attorney on, so I'm really excited to hear about your perspective because you've been a divorce lawyer for 10 years and I'm imagining you have some interesting stories about the kind of the intense battles that often takes place between two people who have previously loved each other very much. So I'm curious, what are some things that you've seen?
Yeah, you're correct. I've certainly seen some interesting stories. I never say that I've seen it all because every year in this line of business, I see something that, I've never seen before. I've seen people who have a hidden spouse in another state. I've seen people, hide children from one another. And that phrase, it's kind of trite. There's a thin line between love and hate, but there's certainly some truth to that because I've seen people demonize the other person and turn them into the biggest monster, at least in their own mind, that used to be the person that they said they loved more than anyone else in the world. And so it's pretty wild what can happen in people's relationships when things go bad.
It is wild. I think a lot of people, when they think of affairs, they think of kind of one-off events that might happen like on a work trip or something. But it's interesting when you do look at most affairs, they tend to last on average like a year or two. And indeed, as you mentioned, some people live a totally outside secret life that they keep from their spouse.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's something that happens over time. And I forget who said it, but someone said that you covet what you see every day. And so a lot of people, it's a workplace romance, but it's certainly not a one-off. It's something that develops over time. And, by the time somebody's caught or it's found out, it's developed and progressed so far that it's shocking to the conscience to see what's happened.
So you've seen people who have gotten to these places, and I'm wondering what to you are some of the biggest factors that you have found eventually lead people on the path to divorce.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about what's the biggest factor that leads to divorce. And certainly there are some, of the obvious things. In my work, I see arguments over finances being a huge factor. Infidelity ranks up there. Abuse is certainly something that we see a lot, unfortunately, in our society. But if you go a level deeper, I think that a lot of these things fall under kind of more general categories, a breakdown of communication or a lack of respect, kind of the eroding of respect that each spouse has for the other tend to be some of the more underlying factors, I think, that lead to divorce. certainly, communication and transparency are huge ones that kind of erode over time. It's not kind of the big abuse or an affair that's been discovered, kind of those things that you think of as these big blockbuster events. More often, I think it's just the everyday, slowly whittling away of the relationship that leads to people getting divorced.
Yeah, I know, and you probably know this too, that a really big shift happened in marriages and divorce in the late 60s when the idea of no fault divorce came into play. And then people were kind of free to get divorced, not when there was some big crazy event that happened, but just when they feel like they had traveled apart, over time.
Yeah. Irreconcilable differences is what we call it, at least here in Georgia, where no fault divorce became more prevalent. And it's interesting. I think a lot of people point to that and blame that for rising divorce rates that, as you correctly identified, kind of occurred over the next couple of decades, particularly the 70s and the 80s, I think is when we saw a peak of those divorces. But a lot of it, a lot of people point to the no fault divorce as being a big win for women's rights. Whereas previously a woman who was in an abusive relationship had to consider, okay, particularly back then, the man was typically the breadwinner and the wife was thinking, okay, how do I get out of this abusive marriage, and facing the prospect of having to go and try to prove that they were being abused, try to prove, the cruel treatment to qualify to get the divorce. And the prospect of not being able to adequately prove that to a judge's satisfaction kept a lot of women in abusive marriages. And the advent of no fault divorces allowed people to go and get a divorce without having to figure, okay, how do I prove that I was cheated on? How do I prove that I've been abused or treated cruelly? But of course, along with that came kind of the escape hatch for irreconcilable differences.
No, it's true that many people do kind of view divorces as a blanketly bad thing, while they don't necessarily recognize that actually, well, if you're in a toxic relationship, if you're in an abusive relationship, then that divorce is a good thing. And that indeed, many women were trapped in bad marriages, and then that no-fault divorce allowed them to break free of them. And in the same vein, when we talk about divorces that aren't necessarily all bad, is that some people do have very amicable, conscious uncoupling. When I think of divorce court, I think of like two people absolutely like fighting in order to get the money or get the kids or get the things that they want. But I'm curious if you've had any experiences of positivity of people getting divorced, of people who still had love for each other and were doing kind of a conscious uncoupling where they wanted the best for the other person while recognizing that they weren't the life partners that they thought they were.
Yeah, certainly there are as many different ways to approach your divorce process as probably there have been divorces. I mean, everyone who goes through it lives their own experience. And yes, I have seen kind of what you would call more conscious uncoupling. I don't see them typically as happy events. I am an attorney after all. And so most of the people who come to me are coming because they haven't been able to figure it out all on their own. But my office does do a fair number of uncontested divorces where couples have come together and said, okay, let's value each other's roles in our children's lives, for example. Let's go through this process in a way that allows us to continue raising our children at least until 18, at least legally under the law, you're required to do that. But honestly, you're going to be at your children's graduations. You're going to be at their weddings. You're going to want to be at these important events and not have the antagonism and tension between ex-spouses trickle down and really impact the children. And so certainly there are plenty of people who are able to go through this process and treat each other fairly, divide their assets and debts in a way that treats both spouses fairly in that process. And I really think it's unfortunate that so many people use the divorce process as a proxy to try to prove who was the more virtuous spouse during the marriage itself. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't go through the uncoupling process consciously, and they use it as a time to either get revenge or try to prove a point. I think that there is a movement towards amicable divorce. There are lots of attorneys who get certified in amicable divorce or create networks where you can do kind of a collaborative divorce, where it's how do we reach our shared goals together rather than how do we win over the other one. And so, that's a trend that even though this is my business, I'd love to see that continue and expand.
I love that amicable divorce and how people do have that intention to continue to support each other in their goals while also separating. And you mentioned earlier there are big reasons people get divorced, like infidelity and abuse. And there are also small, more chronic, longer term reasons people get divorced, like breakdowns in communication and a lack of respect. And you also mentioned that finances are a huge factor. And I'd love to ask you more about that, because it is something I know many couples struggle with, and how money and who makes the money and how the money is spent can be one of the biggest sources of conflict in relationships. So I'm wondering how to avoid that. Like, what, in your opinion, are some good financial strategies that couples can do to manage and talk about their finances in a better way?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, money is one of the biggest stressors in marital relationships. And the challenges have gotten bigger for people of our generation than they were for people of our parents' generation. When my parents got married, it was all the way back in the 1960s. The average couple got married at around age 20, age 21. And a couple of that age, they typically didn't have much in the way of assets. Student loan debt was nothing like it was today. Credit cards had just kind of come around. So, rarely would a 21-year-old have significant credit card debt. They probably didn't own, much in the way of property at that time, didn't have a 401k. And so a couple that got married back then, they were young and they basically were starting their financial lives from scratch. I liken it to somebody starting a business together. You partner together and everything you build is 50-50. You've built it from the ground up. And then you compare that, or you contrast that with today's average marriage, where people are closer to the age of 30 than they are to the age of 20 when they get married. It's not unusual for those spouses to have tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt. Not unusual for them to have a 401k, to already have a mortgage on a house, to own a car. Whereas the couple back then may have one bank account, the average person getting married today may have 4 or 5 bank accounts, 4 or 5 credit cards. So if a couple getting married in the 60s were, like starting a business together, today's couple getting married, it's like merging 2 already formed corporations, right? It's so complex. And you would never do that without you would never merge 2 corporations without sitting down and really hammering out, how are we going to do this in a good way? And on top of all the complexity in terms of just assets and debts is you've also got, a decade of living on your own, of kind of being outside of your parents' house, and you've built up your own financial habits, good and bad. One spouse may be a spender and the other one's a saver. One spouse may carry a ton of credit card debt, whereas the other one pays it all off, every single month. And so I've got a lot of, strategies that I try to help couples with in terms of joining their finances, and just to throw in a plug, I've got a free ebook on my website, prenups.com, called 7 Financial Strategies for a Rock Solid Marriage that I, would ask your listeners to go and check out. But just to give you a taste, one thing is, our parents, it was not uncommon for them to just have one bank account, and everything goes into that one bank account and everything's paid from that one bank account. In today's world, I find it's better for there to be a few different bank accounts. One spouse has their separate bank account, the other spouse has their separate bank account, and then you have a joint bank account that is for your truly joint expenses. And it's a good idea, I believe, for couples to sit down and just make a list. What are the expenses that we have on a monthly basis? which of these are truly joint expenses and which are truly separate expenses. So for example, your mortgage or your rent, your utilities, maybe your health insurance and life insurance, groceries for the household, or meals you go out and eat together, travel you take together. Those are examples of joint expenses that should be paid from a joint account that both spouses contribute to. And then there are separate expenses. The example I like to give is, my wife is probably more likely to spend money on clothes than I am. I can wear the same pair of jeans forever. On the other hand, I'm more likely to go and I got to have the new phone every year when it comes out, have in quotation marks, of course. But and my wife wouldn't understand that. And I don't understand her expenses. We don't have to agree on those discretionary expenses, but because we've agreed that those types of expenses come for our separate bank accounts, the other party can't argue. It doesn't impact the other spouse. We don't argue about it because I don't even see those expenses coming out of the bank account. She's got her money to spend on the things that she wants to spend money on, and I've got the same on my side. And the only expenses that impact each other are the ones that come from the joint bank account, which are the expenses that we agree on. And so I think setting up your bank accounts in the right way, where you both contribute money to a joint bank account, whether the money goes in there and you take an allowance that goes out into your separate bank accounts for your own kind of discretionary spending, or whether the money goes into your separate bank accounts and you contribute, say, proportionally with your incomes to the joint expenses. Setting up your bank accounts in the right way is one of the best things that a couple can do for their relationship.
Absolutely. I do think it is really helpful, just as you said, to have a joint bank account. So then you don't necessarily get mad at your partner if they come home with the thing that they just bought because, okay, I bought this with my money in my account. And don't worry, there's plenty of money in our joint account.
Right. And similarly, I like to say that you have a rule where anything that's going to be spent from the joint bank account, even if it is, something for the household or, groceries or that kind of thing, that you have a rule. Anything over, $200 or $500 or $1,000, it'll differ depending on your income level, but that anything from the joint account over a certain level is discussed between the spouses or between, even if you're just in a relationship and live together, that you discuss those things before those kinds of expenses are made. And so it kind of comes back to, what we were talking about plagues of relationships. If it's communication and transparency, the lack of those things can break down relationships, kind of making rules where you bake that into your relationship. The communication and the transparency has the opposite effect and can help build your relationship.
Yeah. And earlier when you were talking about how it's true, people are marrying later and later. Marriage is now more of like a capstone of one's first part of life. They get the job, they get a few relationships, and then they get married rather than like the cornerstone of their life that happens at the beginning. And I do even remember I had a friend and she was dating a guy for a few weeks before discovering that he was $50,000 in credit card debt. And
oh, yeah.
Which is not necessarily like, you don't have to necessarily write him off, but she was like, that is just not something I want to get involved with. So indeed, people have been adults for a while and they have, habits and certain things you want to consider before necessarily marrying them. And when you were talking about the joint bank account, I was thinking how nice that would be in like a perfect world where both income earners are able to support themselves and they have, a few $1,000s to put into the joint bank account for the partnership. But sometimes there's a primary earner in the relationship and then maybe a person who's not making as much or might not be making anything at all. I'm thinking about a friend group I have, and like there's a couple and they're both working and they both want to be the stay-at-home person. It's like, I think I should quit my job so I can stay at home. And they're like, I think I should quit my job so I can stay at home. So they kind of get into this, well, who's going to be the breadwinner? Who's going to be the stay at home? So what is your advice for when there is a sort of disparate income between the two partners, or one partner wants to make a change that might, result in them making less income?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. This is my opinion. After doing 15 years of seeing every kind of divorce in the book, what I have learned is this: two people living in the same household, but in different socioeconomic classes doesn't work. I've seen a relationship where the husband was making 200 grand a year and they agreed that the wife was going to stay home and raise their two children. And the husband gave the wife a quote unquote allowance of $300 a month. And so she had basically nothing. She was basically trapped at home. She couldn't even really afford gas money because the money was just enough for groceries and for her to cook at home. And meanwhile, he had all of this money in an account. She didn't know what was going on with it. She certainly had no access to it. And so, what I recommend is that, if all of the money, say you've got a situation where the money goes into a joint bank account and then each spouse gets kind of an allowance per month, whether it's $500 a month or $1,000 a month, and that money goes into the separate bank accounts. And it's really going to be best for the relationship in most cases that each spouse still gets a roughly equal amount of discretionary spending money, regardless of the relative incomes. And it's got to be at least a minimum. I mean, you can imagine if one spouse makes 10 grand a month and the other makes 3 grand a month, and they've got their joint expenses such that each spouse has to contribute $2,000 to the joint bank account. Well, then the spouse who makes $3,000 a month has $1,000 left over, whereas the other spouse has $8,000 left over. And that's a recipe for resentment. That is going to breed arguments, no question. And so I think couples have to realize that, when you enter a marriage, you're entering a financial partnership and you're going to play different roles. And if you value the role that stay-at-home parent is playing, then that person needs to have a roughly equal share or access to the money that's coming into the household. It's like you're a business and you're both shareholders in the business. You're both going to get access to the same amount of money. And I think if people can wrap their minds around that concept that, you're no longer just individuals, but that you're in a financial partnership, that it's easy to kind of, stomach that shift of resources. And so, for the couple, I've seen other couples say, okay, if we've got, X amount of discretionary spending, then the person who stays home gets 40% of that discretionary spending, whereas the person who's working gets 60% of the discretionary spending. And so that might be the negotiation that happens between your friends is, who's willing to actually take a pay cut on their allowance, so to speak, to be the person that stays at home. But again, that's what it is. It's a negotiation. I mean, what is the spouse who's going to be staying home with the kids willing to do or willing to offer to have, that role in the relationship that they want without creating the resentment with the other spouse who's saying, gosh, I'm going to the office and busting my butt every day. And the other person, the other spouse is going to be staying home. There's got to be some kind of, agreement or trade-off for that to work, in my opinion.
Yeah, I really like your advice. I think it's really fantastic. And just to clarify, so you're using your example, you said like one partner makes $10,000 a month, the other makes $3,000. You recommend having that joint bank account with all your shared expenses and then sort of splitting that, like each partner gets, say, $3,000 of this discretionary income.
Yeah. Absolutely. And maybe not all of it goes into discretionary income. Maybe some of it goes to, other funds. Like I recommend that couples create some shared financial goals together so that they've got something that they're both working towards. So, in my relationship, our big thing is travel. And so we decided early on, okay, we're going to set aside 5% of our annual take-home income for our travel budget. And that way it's something exciting. It's a shared goal. It's not, it's not a bill to pay, but it's something that as our money goes into this joint account, we know that we're working towards something that we like together. So with the couple that you mentioned, maybe all of the money all the income goes directly into the joint bank account. So it's transparent, everybody sees it, and the joint bills get paid. And then maybe, out of what's left, maybe a portion of that goes to the travel fund. Maybe a portion of that goes to the baby fund or, the house fund for when the baby's born. And then maybe equal amounts or roughly equal amounts go out from the joint bank account into the separate bank accounts so that each spouse still has, control over their own spending money.
So You've mentioned your wife a few times now and your different spending habits and also your shared goals together. And our topic for today is prenup. So I have to ask, I know you've been married for 5 years now. Did you two get a prenup before you got married?
Absolutely.
Okay.
100%. Would not have done it without a prenup.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get into it. And I first just want to go over just some strict definitions and explanation about what a prenuptial agreement is, because I wouldn't be surprised if we have some listeners in other countries who maybe has a different term. For our listeners who don't know or only have heard it, what is a prenup?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked me this question. I think a lot of people who have heard of a prenup still have kind of a fuzzy definition as to what it is. So a prenup is really a written set of rules as to how a couple's finances are going to be handled both during the marriage and in the event of death or divorce. And I like to point out that definition because I think a lot of people think that prenups are just what happens if you get divorced and that there's nothing in there about, what happens during the marriage itself. So that's in essence what a prenup is. It's a set of rules about how your finances and some things that are not strictly financial are going to be dealt with during and then eventually, if necessary, after the marriage.
So let's go into the bit of stigma around it or the hesitancy that a lot of couples do have around getting prenups, because it does, for a lot of people, mean they have to sort of think about this idea of divorce. And obviously they're like, what are you talking about? Like, we're not going to get divorced. We're going to be married and be life partners. And I don't even want to think about this as a possibility. And as a result, people don't necessarily even like the idea of talking about or getting the law and lawyers involved to sign this agreement. So what's your advice on dealing with such hesitancies?
I think that, such a great example to compare this to is insurance, right? Because, you don't want to think about having to get life insurance because you got to think about death. And for the same reason, a lot of people don't want to think about prenups because it makes them think about what happens if we get divorced. And so, just personal bit, I'm not a big believer in jinxes. I believe in, kind of planning. And I believe that in the same way that someone who purchases life insurance is not all of a sudden going to go out and start living more recklessly and, skydiving, without training, that someone who gets a prenuptial agreement is no more likely to get divorced than somebody who doesn't. And, in a large part, it really is insurance and kind of the best insurance that you could ever buy, because, a lot of people think that a prenup is just if you've got a ton of money. People hear a prenup and they think, the image that comes to mind is an old man trying to keep his money away from a young gold digging wife. For better or worse, that's what a lot of people think of when they hear the term prenup.
I tend to think it's the person with the more money, trying to make sure they don't lose half of it in the event of a divorce.
Exactly. But what I found is people who are in most of need of prenups are just regular, ordinary, working class or professional class people who are not extremely wealthy, because a lot of what you're protecting against is the confusion about where each spouse stands financially. And yes, what would happen if the relationship ended is the average cost of a divorce is 15 grand per spouse. And there's all kinds of uncertainty. So, you can get a prenup for a fraction, for say 10% of the total cost of the average divorce case. And when is someone going to be more fair about how their assets would be treated in a divorce? Is it when they're getting married and they love each other and they respect each other? Or is it going to be when the relationship is completely broken down and there's no trust and they may even hate each other? I mean, I think that it's obviously a facetious question. I mean, the answer is obvious. It's at the beginning of the marriage. To me, it's one of the most romantic things you can do. Actually, is to sign a prenup, because you're locking yourself in and saying, no matter what happens, I'm going to be fair. Most people who come to me for a prenup are just like, all we want to do is say, whatever we build together, we're going to split 50-50. And it's easier said than done if you get to, the stage of divorce. But I think that, the stigma around prenups is really unfortunate because if it were just commonplace, if it were just as standard as you get married, you get a marriage license and you get your prenup, it would save so much stress and strain and unnecessary expenses in relationships. Number one, by, taking off the table expensive, the average divorce case takes a year to complete. The impact on children of a contentious divorce is just incalculable when compared to an amicable divorce if it happens. But I also believe that, a well-crafted prenup can actually help couples stay married, can actually be a preventer of divorce by taking off the table some of these, mistakes, very, very predictable arguments, predictable mistakes that couples getting married make over and over, like not setting up their bank accounts correctly. And so all expenses are made from a joint bank account and one spouse is watching the other person's spending habits, drain up all their hard-earned income, rather than set up their bank accounts in a, kind of more intentional and thoughtful way with the help of an advisor like myself who has seen, what kind of mistakes couples make. Or, drafting into their agreement, if somebody does come in with, children from a previous marriage or, a house from a previous marriage, and just having couples get clear, okay, if we're moving into this house together and you owned it prior to the marriage, what are my responsibilities going to be? Are we going to split the mortgage 50-50, but it's still going to stay in your name? Or, is all the equity that you had at the beginning of the marriage going to be yours, but we're going to split everything, from then on? If the water heater breaks, what's my responsibility to help pay for that versus yours? If it's only in your house, if the house is only in your name. And there are tried and true principles that we have to help couples who are getting married today work through these different questions in a way that's fair and that's transparent. Another thing about prenups that a lot of people don't know is for it to be enforceable, you've got to disclose all of your assets and debts and income to the other spouse. And Zach, you might be shocked to know how many people get married. And unlike your friend who found it out at least early on in the relationship about the 50 grand of credit card debt, some people don't figure that out until they've been married for a few years. And then all of a sudden a creditor starts calling, or even worse, their big hefty tax refund they were expecting gets garnished. And that's when it comes out that, oh yeah, I've got 20 grand of unpaid IRS debt, or I've got, 30 grand that I owe to the credit card companies, or, this car that I defaulted on. And getting all of that out on the table at the beginning is so important because, the conversations about money are just so taboo. We're raised in our society to it's impolite to talk about your income. It's impolite to ask the other one, about what their financial status is. And because of that, we've got all this shame. Maybe you've got more debt than you would like to have, or you're not as far along in your, your savings or your retirement as you'd like to be. And there's just no comfortable time to have these financial conversations. Well, prenup forces that conversation. Get everything out on the table, down in writing, and agree on what your rights and responsibilities are going to be, how you're going to handle your money during the course of the marriage itself. And yes, if something goes wrong, it's good to have a safety plan in there that's not going to cost you a year of your life and tens of thousands of dollars to extract yourself from the situation.
So I want to go more into, earlier you mentioned that prenups are a written set of rules on how couples' finances are going to be handled. And then you keep mentioning how basically, when two people come together, two entire financial situations come together at the same time. People come with debt, people come with assets, and then the prenup is on writing those rules. And then later I want to get into the why, and then later I want to get into those principles that you mentioned. But first, let's go into the what. So you do have two people, and your prenup is a set of rules that you're writing. So what are just some examples on those rules, those guidelines that you would see in a prenup at the beginning when two people are coming to it together?
Sure. So, one part of the prenup that I usually recommend that couples look at has to do with who owns what. And if you just get married without a prenup, in pretty much all of the 50 states, what the law is going to say is everything that you own is going to be assumed to be joint until proven otherwise. And so, a common argument that I see couples have at the end of the relationship
so all
is
the debt, all the things,
all the debt, all of the assets. And so, say you've got a 401k and, you've got 200 grand in at the time you get married, and you get divorced, you got 400 grand in there. Well, normally the 200 grand that you have coming in should be your property, and then you split what you built during the marriage, right? You should keep the first 200 and split the other 200. The problem with that is people have been married 10, 12, 15 years, trying to go back and prove what you had at the time of the marriage, which would normally be your separate property and not up for division, is near impossible. I mean, imagine if you had to go find your 401k statement from over a decade ago. How much luck would you have? Or, maybe your bank, maybe you banked at Wachovia, or Washington Mutual, and your bank doesn't even exist anymore. And so trying to prove what you had, at the time of the marriage is impossible. And so what I like to recommend to couples is that they set up, that you can opt out of the default law, which says everything is lumped together and everything is marital and up for division unless you can prove otherwise, and do what's more intuitive for couples, which is how you title something is how it's owned. And that way, if you have an account that you want to be your account, and this is going to be my play money, or this is going to be my investment account, then you title it in your name. And if you want something to be a joint asset, then you title it in both names. And that's how you can kind of, protect each other against, if you want to start a business, but you don't want the other person to be at risk if things go badly, you just title it in your separate name. If you want it to be a joint endeavor between you and your spouse, then you put it in joint names. And that creates a much more intuitive setup so that everyone knows where they stand at any given time. If it's both of our names are on it, then we're both on the hook for it, any expenses, but we both reap the rewards from, any benefits from it, rather than what happens in a lot of situations where nobody talks about the money and one spouse is saving for the retirement and the other spouse is just trusting that they're doing the right thing with the money, but there's no visibility and they never really know where they stand. Like, do I get to share in that 401k that my spouse is saving in, or do I not? People, the average lay person can't be expected to know, be up on the divorce laws of their state. And so kind of getting clarity on those kinds of things. But also, in a prenup, I like having the rules like I talked about, discussing expenditures. Or another thing that I recommend couples do is, in my own prenup, we have a rule where we have to sit down every December and talk about what our retirement contributions are going to be for the upcoming year.
So in your prenup, it says you have to have a conversation every December.
Yes, we sit down every December and we agree upon what our retirement contributions are going to be for the upcoming year, because we have a rule that our retirement accounts belong to ourselves, but we try to make sure that we're contributing equal amounts so that we both have assets in our own names that, belong to each of us, but that we're both contributing to them regularly throughout the marriage, so that anything ever happened, my wife has got sufficient retirement funds in her own name, and then I've got some in my own name, and then we try to keep them equal throughout the marriage. And what happens is that house meeting that we've got baked into our agreement also becomes the time that we discuss, all right, what's going to be our budget for travel this coming year? Are we going to put money into a health savings account? Are we going to put away, money, so that we can, pay for, daycare for our daughter this upcoming year? We kind of bake in this strategy of communication. We force the communication by agreement. We also have something in our agreement that says either spouse can trigger counseling. So a lot of times, the challenge is when a couple needs to go to some marriage counseling, that one spouse doesn't want to do it. Invariably, it's one spouse or the other doesn't want to do it. Well, we have in our agreement that either spouse at any time can trigger 3 counseling sessions, and you got to do it. And before either party is allowed to file for divorce, if things are going badly, you've got to do 6 counseling sessions first. And courts will enforce these agreements there. I mean, I've seen people who have tried to, just run to the courthouse and file for divorce without following it. And the court will dismiss the case and say, no, your agreement says you got to go do some counseling. And so at least you give an opportunity to try to work some things out. And even if you end up getting divorced, maybe you talk about how you could do it in a conscious way and not destroy your finances by giving the money to lawyers instead. Or maybe you talk about how do we be good co-parents for our kids before you run out and lawyer up. So, there are all kinds, you're really only limited by your own creativity. And there are all kinds of things that couples can do to, protect against what they fear the most, whether that's, divorce, whether that's a spouse not wanting to do counseling, whether it's, not being transparent with the money. A common clause we put in is that both spouses get to be on every call or meeting with the financial advisors, so that both spouses are are in the loop. I do recommend that in every couple that one person be the CFO, the financial officer, and most couples, when I mentioned that to them, they look at each other because everyone knows which one of them is going to be, who the spreadsheet person is in the relationship. But just like a CFO at a company, that person would have a responsibility to come and give a quarterly report to the shareholders. You don't just handle the information and not share it. You got a responsibility to report back. This is the state of the finances. And so whoever takes on that role as the CFO in the relationship has to also take on the responsibility to share all that information periodically with the other spouse. So that's just a few examples of the kinds of things that I recommend couples think about.
Yeah, so I'm really curious about that enforcement, or basically what happens when somebody isn't following the guidelines and rules that were set out in the prenup. Like, what happens when you don't have your December financial meeting?
Yeah, no, great question. And it's a common question I get. I mean, obviously, most couples are not going to run to the courthouse and file a lawsuit to enforce their agreement if their spouse is, a couple weeks late on the December sit down meeting. But what I have found is that it's kind of like every other contract that you have. You don't run to the courthouse and file to evict, your tenant if they're 3 days late on the rent. But there's something about putting it down in writing that this is the expectation that makes people more likely to agree to it. More likely to follow the agreement, because a lot of times the problem is, well, you agreed that at the beginning of our marriage that we would always do this, or that we would go to counseling if I wanted it. And the other spouse says, I don't remember that, or no, I didn't agree to that. Just having it in writing and being able to pull it out and show it to the other person is usually, just like with any other contract that you sign in life, is usually enough to encourage both people to stick by the agreement. But if they don't, and things do go south and you end up in front of a judge, well, then you've got written evidence as to what you agreed to, and you can present your evidence that the other person didn't follow it, and the court can do with that what they want. I mean, the idea, my goal for drafting these prenups that include a lot of clauses about how couples will handle themselves during the marriage of themselves is not to increase litigation or to make people start going to the court during the marriage to try to enforce these provisions, but to really give people, a set of guidelines that's written down on paper that they can go back to if necessary and say, hey, this is what we agree to do in our relationship. And I think that there is a certain magic about putting it in writing and putting your ink, having it notarized, having it witnessed by, a third party that gives it more weight and makes people much more likely to follow the spirit of the agreement, whether or not they actually, end up in front of a judge trying to enforce it.
Yeah, it's so interesting because we have had a number of guests on the show who have kind of created their own paradigms on how to have the right conversations in relationships. So we had one guest, and I think her book was called Marriage Meetings. And then another guest, Alicia Munoz, had a book on basically like questions to ask your partner. And what I'm hearing from you is a really big reason to have a prenup is that it does force a lot of really important conversations to happen in the relationship.
I think that's exactly right. I think that too many couples get married without having these critical, really important conversations and put their head in the sand. I haven't read the books that you've mentioned, but I can guess that they are encouraging the intentional sitting down and having these important conversations, even though they might be a little uncomfortable and we'd otherwise prefer just to kind of put our head in the sand and hope for the best. But that, the relationship at the end of the day is going to be better for having had these conversations. And if your spouse is going to be the kind of person to, hide 20 grand of debt, you want to know that earlier rather than later. If your spouse is going to be the kind of person to hoard all the money and make 200 grand a year, but want to leave you with 300 a month, you want to know that ahead of time too. Is the other person going to want to leave you high and dry if you're home taking care of the kids? Do they believe that you don't deserve a share of the money that's coming into the household? Wouldn't you like to know that?
Would be a very good piece of info to know. Absolutely. Yeah. So we went into the why, and now I'm curious about making that conversation go well. So you mentioned there are some tried and true principles on how to make the prenup conversation go well. So what are some of those things? I know you can't tell us all of the principles, but what are some things you want to do to make the conversation, which can be vulnerable and can be challenging, go as easy as possible?
Yeah. So I like to break apart the prenup conversation into three steps. There's coming into the marriage, there's before the marriage, there's during the marriage, and there's after the marriage. And I think approaching it in kind of these three stages makes it a little more palatable, easier to digest, right? So coming into the marriage is you sit down and you expose your finances to each other. Literally write it down on paper. What are the bank accounts that you have? What are the assets? What are the debts that you're coming into the relationship with? And you can see a lot from that conversation. You know, what are your habits? Are you carrying credit card debt? Are you paying things off? Are you saving a lot in your retirement account? Kind of that exposure as to what brought you to this point and what are you coming into the marriage with? And then step two is, what are we going to build together? How are we going to, have structure our kind of financial partnership here, our business, how are we going to merge our corporations? And that's where you have the conversations as to what expenses are going to come from the joint account, what expenses are going to come from our separate accounts, what are the other, things that we want to work into our budget, whether it be travel or kids or a house. And that part can actually be fun because you're talking about building your lives together. What are the things we want to save up for? What are our shared financial goals? And then only when you get to step three do you talk about, what I call the contingency plans. And it's not just divorce. It's, do we both have wills? Are we both going to agree to put, to have a certain amount of life insurance in place? Do we want to leave money for children? Are we leaving money for other family members? And yes, what happens if we don't work out? Can we agree that we're going to do it fairly and, share the money with each other rather than share it with attorneys at the end of the day? And I think if you break it down into kind of those steps, it can come from a more loving place and supporting the marriage itself rather than, well, if this doesn't work out, I'm taking my stuff and I'm leaving. And this doesn't even have to be a conversation that happens in one day. I mean, you're talking about building the rest of your life together. This is not something that's worth just, 1 hour, after dinner. It's something that, that can take stages. But I think breaking apart, into those three steps is something that I've seen work for plenty of couples that have come to my office.
Yeah, I love that. I think those are really awesome steps. And really awesome way to break it down. And I do appreciate you bringing in like the fun adventure connecting part of it, because it can be very sterile and almost, like lawyery, like having to think about these things and not very romantic.
Right.
Now, when you mentioned like come together and expose your finances, I was thinking about somebody who just like opens up their phone and they're like, $10 is what I have in my account right now. That's it. Like there's no big secrets. There's also not a lot of big decisions to be made around like how much to split the limited money I have in my account. And I would just want to use this facetious example as an intro to my question about when we might not need a prenup. What kind of, if couples who a prenup might be unnecessary for?
Sure. So fair warning, I am biased, right? I'm the founder of prenups.com. And so when I hear someone say, do we not need a prenup? I hear, do we not need a plan for how we're going to handle our finances when we get married? But certainly, I mean, if you're making minimum wage and you're living check to check, and the expenditure of a few grand is a different amount depending on what your financial status is, right? You're not going to forego paying your rent to get a prenup if you're getting married. But I think that I would err on the side of you don't need a ton of assets for it to be worthwhile. And even if you do not go hire a lawyer and get an actual, prenuptial agreement done, I think it is worthwhile, no matter who you are, if you're getting married, to sit down and still have the conversations, to still go through the process like you were getting a prenup. So the three steps that I talked about, what are you coming in with? How are you going to handle your finances during the marriage? And what are your contingency plans, if the worst comes to the worst in the relationship? I think it's beneficial to any relationship. But, particularly for people who are getting married later in life, if you own a business, if you've got a house going in, if you've got retirement in assets, not even a lot, even if you got 20 grand, set to the side, it's worth talking about, coming to an understanding as to, okay, this is what we build together is joint, and, what we had coming in is separate. And, I don't expect you to take my 401k the same way that, like, I don't expect you to pay the credit card debt that I'm bringing in. And just to kind of, create a blank slate that you guys are going to build your financial relationship from the time that you join together. And if that's your intention, and just, come to some kind of agreement on it. And so, I think that prenups are useful tools. If you can get a legally enforceable one, you can afford to do it, I say do it. I think it's very, very rare that somebody regrets having at least gone through the process. And, certainly if you can get a legally enforceable one and get some clarity as to where you and your spouse are going to stand financially, what your plans are for the marriage, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor.
Yeah, I love that. You don't necessarily need a prenup, but it does really help to have a plan and also to have these very real conversations. And a prenup obviously offers a good framework to do those. So thank you so much, Aaron, for coming on the show. I feel like it's a free consultation. What do you call the initial meeting with a lawyer?
Yeah, consultation.
I appreciate the consultation. I feel like I and all the listeners on this show have just gotten their free consultation with you. So I really appreciate you coming on. And I do have to finish by asking you a question I love to ask all of my guests, which is quite simply, what do you wish everyone knew about love?
Yeah, I love this question. I wish everyone knew that love is intentional. I think that a lot of people expect that it's just supposed to happen, that there's no work associated with it, that it should just always be easy, and that there's no, difficulty, no difficult conversations that happen with it. And, maybe it's the lawyer in me, but I don't like to leave things up to chance. And I think that love is something that is best when it's worked on.
Absolutely. So thanks so much, Aaron, for coming on to the show. And for our listeners who want to learn more about you, how can they find you?
Yes, I would love for your listeners to come check me out at prenups.com. It's just like it sounds, prenups.com. Like I said, there's a free ebook on there for you to download, and you can also set up a consultation if you wanted to meet with someone in my office right there online.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Aaron, for coming on to the show. And thank you, listeners, for listening to the show. We hope you remember that a prenup is simply a written set of rules as to how the couple is going to manage their finances during marriage, during death and divorce. And it's not just a rich person who doesn't want their spouse to take their money, but people that can use prenups include everyone, including regular working class people, because it does force you and help you to have those really important conversations that anyone should have before coming into the legal institution of marriage. So you can talk about what you want to do with your finances coming into the marriage, talk about what you're building together during the marriage, and then come up with those contingency plans. And you don't necessarily need a prenup, but it can very much help to have a plan and to have these conversations because love is intentional. If you want to learn more about me, you can head to zachbeach.com and learn more about the show at theheartcenter.com. Thanks again, Aaron.
Thanks so much for having me, Zach.
Thanks again for listening to the Learn to Love podcast. To learn more about the show and your host, head over to zachbeach.com or theheartcenter.com. You can also follow Zach on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.